So the presentation, Lost Leviathans, Lake Michigan's biggest ships, it was a result of an idea that I had as I was working on a database of all the ships still missing on Lakes Michigan and Superior for the purposes of wreck hunting. This is something that I built about 10 years ago, was a full database of every ship that is really a wreck hunting target. It turned out there were a lot more than I thought there were. And so it was the sort of inspiration for a talk, and I started thinking about making a book out of this, or even a series. So um, before we get out on that, though, I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. Most of you here know me already. You know that I've been doing this a while. I'm the administrator of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group, and I collect a lot of antiquarian material related to shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. Um, some of you may have seen my new book, Ghosts of the Oceanic Coast, Shipwrecks of Pentwater, Michigan, that is just come out. I will be getting the bulk quantities of them, I think, on Friday in the mail to sell. So a couple other things I'm interested in, though, are the shipwrecks from the Keweenaw Peninsula, where I'm from. I've researched them extensively, as well as the beavers and the foxes. Some of you may have my book, Fathoms Deep, on Wisconsin shipwrecks. And then, of course, I look for shipwrecks and collect antiquities and do stuff on social media. Um, the main thing, though, that I want to talk to people about tonight are these missing ships. You know, how many missing ships are there on the lakes? Well, there's a lot. The problem is there's a lot of misinformation online, right? Generated by people who don't have empirical data. You hear this figure of 10,000, 8,000, 6,000. Um, really, people don't really have a very good idea. Most people only know about the more famous ships like the Marquette and Bessemer number 2, or the Carruthers. And so let's look at the actual numbers of what's really out there empirically. So Great Lakes shipwrecks by the numbers. So we know a lot about the shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. And the way we know is that there are a lot of historical records. And for example, every ship on the Great Lakes after about 1812 had to be enrolled at a U.S. or Canadian customs house. And almost all those records have been preserved. And as we've gotten better with data and with databases, and we've entered into the technological age, those records have all been compiled. And we've found records for about 40,000 commercial vessels on the Great Lakes between 1678 and 1960. A lot of people don't know there is a database that of every vessel on the Great Lakes between 1900 and 1960. It's the Herman Runge vessel card database that I helped transcribe. I personally did about 25,000 of those records back when I was in my early 20s. And he went through every list, every one of the annual lists of U.S. merchant vessels. He went through and basically all the vessel registers, and he took out every Great Lakes vessel and made a card, even the little fish tugs. He stopped in about 1960 because he died in 58. But also, it was not fortunate that he died, but fortunate that he stopped then, because a lot of people started registering their yachts as documented vessels for tax breaks. And so after about 1960, the annual list of merchant vessels isn't as good. But okay, so we know there are about 40,000 commercial vessels. We also know that there are about 8,000 of what we'd call shipwrecks. Now, the numbers of what we call a shipwreck depend on your definition of shipwreck, right? Divers call any vessel on the bottom of the lake that they can dive a shipwreck. But many of those are not from actual accidents. They were abandoned or scuttled out there. A lot of these things are in harbors and in rivers where they were left. Some are under beaches and fragmentary. Some are broken up on reefs, right? But in short, we have about 8,000 shipwrecks on the Great Lakes if you include all the old hulks sunk in harbors and rivers that people call a shipwreck, fragmentary wrecks that are in the shallows, under sandbars, under beaches, or on reefs, and old hulls that were towed out and scuttled. However, we have about 6,000 actual shipwrecks from accidents. That means commercial vessels that were lost due to an accident. They never sailed again. They may or may not have extant remains, right? A lot of these vessels that were cut up or scrapped or burned. This does not include vessels that were recovered or rebuilt. It doesn't include diveable shipwrecks that were intentionally abandoned or sunk, right? Because an actual shipwreck from an accident means it wasn't abandoned or sunk. And it doesn't include losses to modern yachts or pleasure boats, right, after 1960 or so. So 6,000, where does that number come from? Well, where it comes from, and the best database we have, is the Dave Swayze Great Lakes Shipwreck database. And Dave Swayze was really more the curator. He didn't do all the work. What happened is a group of about 10 of us contributed thousands of wrecks from our own research to Dave, and we built that database as a group effort between people like Jack Messmer, myself, Bill McNeil, Walt Lewis, Jerry Metzler. A lot of us contributed a lot of data. I contributed probably 1,000 Lake Michigan shipwrecks that he didn't have to the database. But the end result was a database with about 5,000 shipwrecks in it. Now, just a moment. So, what we came up with in this database was about 6,000 total lost shipwrecks due to accident. We still find many. Dave was pretty conservative about what he chose to include as a shipwreck, right? He wouldn't include a lot of wrecks that he was absolutely sure were recovered. So we know he underreports a little bit, but not by much. So we have empirical data about a pretty good population of shipwrecks. And because we have that much, we probably have 80-90% of all the ships that were lost due to actual shipwrecks. So we can make a lot of predictive, observations about that data. It's statistically significant amount of shipwrecks. We have the vast majority of them, and we know about them. So this data really came primarily from news microfilms, right? But also from wreck reports, from a lot of different sources. Let's talk about the numbers of shipwrecks that have extant remains. This is an estimate based upon Chris Cole's book, which is probably the best book there is, his Great Lakes Shipwreck Guide, which has pretty much all the diveable shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, right, in it. I think there's about 1,500. And then we have another large group of shipwrecks that have extant remains that emerged from under beaches. So we think that we have about 4,000 shipwrecks that have extant remains. Of those, about 3,000 have been found and identified. So the vast majority have been found and identified. Most are fragmentary and buried under beaches. About 1,000, like I say, are considered diveable shipwrecks, moderately deep and intact. So these last three numbers are a little softer than the 6,000. We have about 6,000 shipwrecks from accidents, about 8,000 total, if you count every hulk that's in a back harbor. All right, let's talk about numbers of missing ships. There are about 650 missing ships that are still on the bottom of the Great Lakes in deep water. I know this because I've gone through the database myself and taken out every single vessel that went down offshore, didn't hit a reef, didn't go on the beach, wasn't recovered, and hasn't been found. There are about 650 total in the Great Lakes. That means vessels that sank or were sunk offshore and haven't been found. It doesn't include strandings, things that are fragmentary or buried or in rivers or that have been found. This is an interesting count. This is the counts I have by lake. When I went through my database and figured out how many ships were still undiscovered offshore in each lake. There are about 250 in Lake Michigan, about 200 in Lake Erie, about 100 in Lake Huron, and only about 50 in Ontario or Superior. Well, there's a reason for these numbers, and I think the big one is that Michigan and Erie had a lot of smaller vessels, a lot of wooden schooners, a lot of ships that went down out in the lake, whereas Huron primarily saw trans-lake commerce, right, to bigger vessels. Most of what's out in Huron that hasn't been found were ships that were going from someplace else to someplace else. Lake Ontario and Lake Superior are both widely known to not have that many wrecks to begin with. They have, perhaps a third of the wrecks of Lakes Michigan, Erie, and Huron. And most of the ships on Superior were large, big ore boats. You're going to see that's what's missing up there. And on Lake Ontario, there just were a lot fewer wrecks. And again, small, not as many big cities. So You can see also a bit about the spatial distribution. These maps are Calvin Devine's Lake Michigan and Lake Erie shipwreck maps. And he's got the only chart where he actually plots almost all well, I shouldn't say almost all, but probably two-thirds of the wrecks that we know about today, he knew about in 1961 when he did these charts. And he did a nice spatial plot. And what you see is really the spatial layout of where ships are. And one of the things that becomes abundantly clear is that things like the Lake Michigan Triangle are just BS, right? Shipwrecks cluster around cities, right? That's what we see, and around places where there were, ports. All right, let's move along. There are about 200 undiscovered Lake Michigan shipwrecks. Here they all are. This is an export from my database of just the names, the lengths, and where they are. I have 217. I know there are more because I keep finding more every time I take another pass at it. But I've got them in order of size, so I'm not going to go leave that up too long because I don't want to dump my whole database to everybody. But about 200 undiscovered, 217 or so. All right. I'm going to take a short, well, let's dive into this before I take a short break. So the top 20 missing shipwrecks in 2010 are listed here on all the Great Lakes. And one of the things you're going to see that's really interesting is half of these shipwrecks have since been found. There's been a lot of ships found. And the reason is that people are looking for them actively. The Henry B. Smith was the second biggest ship. This was found in 2013 by Ken Merriman and Jerry Eliason. The Steinbrenner was just found by Ken and Jerry in September of 2023. The Cypress has been found. The Hydrus, the Scotia Dock, the Senator, 2013. The Pere Marquette 18, 2020. The only two big ones that are still missing are the DM Clemson and the James Carruthers. And there are reasons they're still missing. They're very far from shore, and they have a thoroughly last known position. But down near the bottom, you can see there's a lot still missing. One of the trends you're going to see here is that the biggest ships missing were all on Superior and Huron. That's because the big ships are ore boats, right? They were bulk carriers, and there wasn't as much bulk carrier traffic on Lake Michigan. Biggest ship lost on Lake Michigan was the Senator, found by Paul Ehorn in 2013. The second was the Pere Marquette 18, neither of which were ore boats. They were carrying, railroad cars and automobiles, respectively. Likewise, Erie doesn't have that many big ships. The Marquette and Bessemer number 2, which is just ridiculous that it hasn't been found, is still missing. But you can see, when you get down into the bottom, you start to see that Lake Michigan had smaller ships on it, and so did Lake Erie. So that's an interesting trend. Ontario has no missing ships in the top 20. And again, it's because Ontario did not see the big ore boats, right? They primarily stopped at Lake Erie. So an interesting trend here. Also, NOAA has stated that they want to map all 5 Great Lakes in high resolution by 2030. They believe that by doing that, they will find all of the significantly large ships still missing on the Great Lakes. And I think there's some truth to that. So more about that later. All right, here's the top 20 still missing on Lake Michigan. I'm going to talk about the top 6 tonight, but there are quite a few others that are interesting that a lot of people wouldn't guess or wouldn't have thought about. I personally have looked for the Kate Winslow and the H.W. Sage. Polynesia is an interesting one off Sheboygan. It's in the new Wisconsin Shipwreck Coast National Marine Sanctuary, maybe. Yeah, it's actually pretty far out. The Plymouth, one that Rick Mixter's researched quite a lot, is still missing. And then one that a lot of people don't think about, the Churchill, is a big boat off of Waukegan that hasn't been found. A few others that are notable are the big steamer Mendota, the big steamer Nevada, and the Equinox are all quite interesting off Big Sable Point. So interesting ships that haven't been found. All right, I'm going to take a short break, and I'm going to do a quick check-in on social media. We have a number of people that claim that they can't, okay, they had to shut down Facebook, and now they're getting it. Good. Okay, cool. And I'm just going to take and see how many people we have that we're able to get in. All right, we've got a good number of people watching. Excellent. All right. let's continue onward, onward and upward. So that's kind of by the numbers, right? How many ships there really are, how many shipwrecks there really are of all kinds. You know, the trends, the top 20, and where they are, what lakes they're on, and why. Let's talk about searching for them. So, who's finding these ships and why? And how are they finding them? So, who's looking? Well, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society and Jerry Eliason and Ken Merriman probably have the most finds recently. They share something in common, and that's that they have pretty big boats, they get out on the water a lot, and they have pretty good equipment. So they're looking, they're specifically tailoring their gear and their searches to large deep water grids, and that's where they're finding them. Although Dave Trotter and Paul Ehorn have also found some significant wrecks, and I know Dusty Cliffman's been looking too for some of these. Um, People are looking for these because they're well preserved. They're unique historical objects with archaeological significance. Um, the other reason people want to find them is they've got a shelf life. A lot of these are steel wrecks and or iron hulled wrecks, and we know that those things are falling apart with time. The car ferry Milwaukee is a good example of Milwaukee. You know, it was completely intact in 1970 when it was, or 72 when it was found. Now it's falling apart. So there's a real, desire to find these before they start to collapse. But to find them, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. The biggest thing that's needed to find these shipwrecks is original research. Like you can't just, read somebody's book and go searching for this. These guys that find these wrecks really build complete histories of these ships. They get every single bit of data that's possibly available, from weather data, debris, newspaper accounts, wreck reports, government reports, shipping company reports, insurance reports, court case reports, you name it. They scrape all that stuff. Original research is also important for another big reason, and that is that the there are new sources coming online regularly. New resources become available each year. So 3 years ago, we didn't know that the National Archives in Chicago had 8,000 wreck reports in these rotting away in these old leather binders from 1870 to about 1930 for just about every major ship that went down in the Great Lakes, and most of them are written in the captain's own hand. So if you're gonna, just do, read someone's book or rely on research that was 5 years old, you wouldn't know about that. The last three shipwrecks I found, um, the Trinidad, the Muir, and the Evanson, each one had a shipwreck report in that stash down at the National Archives. Not saying that was the main way I found them, but it sure didn't hurt. So original research, you know, find out what new stuff is available, because there's new stuff being made available, new historical records every year. And these guys who wrote these books back 20, 30, 40 years ago, before the information age, got a lot of things wrong. And so, it behooves you to do your own research. Um, so a couple other things that are available now, in addition to the National Archives rec reports, is these Admiralty case files at the National Archives. Another big one is geomagnetic bottom data, right? A bunch of these ships, the Henry B. Smith was found with geomagnetic data that the government had. Um, Ken and Jerry did a FOIA request, or I think it was Dan Fountain did the FOIA request and got that data, and they figured out a way, that's their trade secret, to map it onto the lake. And so they were able to find where some of these big steel ferrous body hits are on the bottom of the lake, and that's how a lot of these wrecks were found. Other things, NOAA survey data, right? NOAA is starting to map the lake bottoms, and they missed a few things. Like I found the wreck of the barge industry up off the Beaver Islands from NOAA data. They hadn't released it. They hadn't said they found a wreck. They just had a little mark in the middle of my search grid that said obstruction. So I asked Ken Merriman to go and look at it, and sure enough, it was the industry. So NOAA, you can get that. It's public data, and if you look at their scan data, you can find wrecks that they didn't release. All right. Enough about searching. Um, you have to do original research if you want to find these deep wrecks. Let's talk about the big six. What's out there and Where would you want to look for them? So one of the things these wrecks all have in common is that they're all going to be difficult to find. There's a reason these 6 ships haven't been found. For the most part, they're far from shore. In many cases, the last known position is poorly known. The water in most cases is very deep. In some cases, there are conflicting loss accounts. And the main reason these 6 Lake Michigan shipwrecks, these big ones that are left, haven't been found is that they're relatively obscure outside the maritime history community. How many people know about the Charles Stewart Parnell, off the Beavers, or the Frank L. Vance? Some people are going to know about the Java. I think most people know about the Gilcher. She's the biggest and was pretty famous as the sister ship of the Western Reserve. But those are the reasons these wrecks haven't been found. So I'm going to dive into them, and I'm going to start with the smallest and work up to the biggest, I guess, and see where we get. So, and I want to tell you too that out of all the wrecks I've talked about tonight, the biggest one's still missing on the Great Lakes. I can tell you that at least 2 of them have been found. I can't say which, and I can't say by whom. But I think a year from now, you will know that 2 of the ships I've talked about have been discovered. All right, let's dive in. The smallest of the big 6 is the steamer Lac La Belle. This is a pretty famous passenger ship. She was the sister of the steamer Ironsides that was lost on the Michigan side. She was on the Milwaukee to Grand Haven trade in the passenger and package freight trade. She was built in 1864 at Cleveland, so a pretty ship. This is from an original stereo view in my collection. I actually own the original of this photo of her at Milwaukee. As you can see, she was quite an attractive arch-sided steamer. One of the things that a lot of people wonder about this ship is that she had been in a collision on the St. Clair River in 1866 when she was only 2 years old. And she spent 3 years laying on the bottom of the St. Clair River in 25 feet of water with only her top of her pilot house sticking out of the water. They raised her and rebuilt her in 69. And some people wonder if that, played a role in her sinking only 3 years later in October of 1872. So a little more about this ship's final trip. She left Milwaukee at about 9 p.m. on Sunday, October 13th, 1872, heading for Grand Haven in a moderate gale. She had an interesting cargo. She was carrying about 19,000 bushels of barley, so a lot of barley in her hold, barreled flour, barreled pork. She had 25 barrels of whiskey, which is quite interesting, and that's verified. 20 tons of animal feed, sundries. She had a bunch of stoves, iron stoves, and 53 passengers and crew. So she got out off Milwaukee a ways, and she was found to be leaking at about 11 p.m. So that's about 2 hours only after she left. Ships of this size went about 12 miles per hour, so she'd probably be about 25 miles off of Milwaukee, give or take, when she was found to be leaking. So the captain turned back from Milwaukee. But about midnight, a rogue wave boarded her. The storm started to get worse, and the wave extinguished her boiler fires. After that, she was driven before the gale, which was out of the north, eventually going down by the stern. Now, about 5 a.m., this is quite a while later, right? That's 6 hours after they turned back from Milwaukee. She actually sank, or was abandoned, I should say. The lifeboats all the lifeboats made it ashore. About 6 miles south of Racine, 12 hours later, 8 crew died when one of the lifeboats collapsed. So most of the people survived this one. So I'm going to talk about the search grid, and I'm going to lay out sort of where things are here. What we see with the Lac La Belle is she was coming across on this line from Milwaukee to Grand Haven. She got about 25 miles out, we think, so about 2 hours into the trip. And she turned back, so probably made it to about here when her boiler fires got put out by the storm, and she was driven southward by the gale. We have a pretty good article here. This is interesting because the cook, William Monroe, said that when the ship sank and they abandoned ship, he said he could see land 8 to 10 miles distant. That's interesting. Also, the lifeboats came ashore way down here, from Racine all the way down to Kenosha, and the wind was out of the north. So the first lifeboat came ashore right up here, just north of Racine, right near right at the harbor, actually. So we think, well, we know that all accounts place this about off Racine, but they vary from between 8 miles out and 25 miles out, with the wind coming out of the north. Now, conventional wisdom on this, and what I think happened here, is that she is actually closer to shore than 25 miles. She was 25 miles off Milwaukee when she started to leak, but by the time she sank, I think the cook's account of being 8 to 10 miles offshore is about right. I think the Lac La Belle is probably off wind point. I think she's in this box here. And I think you can use the lifeboat scatter here as a, sort of a predictive vector. Also, a lot of debris came ashore. So, we have a lot of debris that's coming ashore down here south, Kenosha to Waukegan. And then this is a bathymetric chart from the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory. And these are some of the depths that we get when we look at from 8 miles out to about 15 miles out. We put a dot here on where I think this ship is. Actually, it's probably a little bit further north than this. It's probably about 300 feet of water, I would say, give or take 20. And it's off here. This is a big grid. I mean, if you want to go out there and scan that, you're going to be scanning a while. Part of the problem is, a lot of people have never actually looked at this data empirically and then looked at the accounts and put a grid up for the Lac La Belle. But I think this wreck is findable. It's an 8 by 10 grid. That's 80 square miles. That makes it a wreck I don't go look for, just because to me that's too big. All right, Lac La Belle. Probably found someday. The next one's my favorite of the whole lot, and it's the Java. This is a cool ship. This is another one that I own an original stereo view of. This is an H.H. Bennett stereo view of downtown Milwaukee in about 1881, and that's the Arabia. Oh, that's her sister. That's her sister, the Arabia. The Java was never photographed. She was built in 1873, and she was lost shortly after in 1878, and so she was only around for 5 years, actually under 5 years, 4 years, 4 seasons, and so there are no photos of her. And people have really looked. She was one of 5 identical sisters. Her other sisters were the Russia, the Cuba, the Scotia, and the Arabia. So those of you who are divers know that the Russia is a major dive site, right, on Lake Huron. Tom Farnquist found her. And the Scotia wrecked on Keweenaw Point, and she's broken up, but is also diveable. Her other sisters, the Cuba and the Arabia, like most iron-hulled vessels, lasted forever. My God, they lasted almost till World War II. This vessel was 231 feet long, so a big iron-hulled steamer. In the package freight trade mostly, although she did carry some passengers. You can see they had some small deck houses. This vessel was lost on August 18th, 1878, off Big Sable Point. She was bound from Bay City, Michigan to Chicago and then to Milwaukee. She was carrying about 300 tons of fine household goods when she went down. So, parlor stoves. There was a lot of salt on board, too. So she did have a bulk cargo of salt, but she was carrying a lot of furniture, a lot of, glassware, dishes, stuff for department stores that was coming to Chicago and Milwaukee. She left Bay City on Saturday, August 17th, 1878. At 8 a.m. the next day, she was off Big Sable Point when a loud bang was heard. The whole ship gave a tremendous shudder. Modern historians believe that a large log probably lodged in her starboard propeller, causing the shaft to break internally and to slide out of the stern, allowing water to enter freely. And I think that's kind of what the newspapers of the day said too, is that water just started to just pour into her stern, so much that it had to have been through the stuffing box. She was a twin propeller. And so the starboard shaft, the one on the right side looking at her stern, slipped right out of the vessel. The crew took to the lifeboats immediately because the vessel began sinking by the stern in under 30 minutes. The schooner J.P. Marsh was standing by and rescued everybody. Now, there's an interesting account, and this really complicates things a little bit. And I'll show you this article with the search grid. 4 schooners reported that they were anchored over the site, recovering goods as they floated to the surface. So, like crates and barrels started to float to the surface, and the schooner captains were throwing their lumber cargoes overboard so they could make room for the cargo of the Java. And some of the cargo was brought back to the dock, which it had to be by law, but a lot of it never just ended up in the homes of these schooner captains. All right, let's talk about the Java and why she hasn't been found. This is Big Sable Point. We know that she was probably on the shipping lane. That's one of the more interesting things. So here's the chart of the day, right? And this is the shipping lane comes out to Big Sable, and it makes a turn right here to go down to Chicago. And the accounts of where she went down, I think they were saying 8 to 10 miles off of the harbor. I'm sorry, off of the point. 15 miles out. They say 15 miles out. I don't think that's right. The shipping lane wasn't 15 miles out. The shipping lane was 8 miles out. What she would have been doing 15 miles out, I don't know, because vessels made the best time and used the least fuel when they followed these lanes. So, I do believe that she is not that far out. Now, they gave a depth of 250 feet for this vessel. Now, I don't know if that's accurate. One of the things they say, yeah, here it is. Learn that the great ship is in from 200 to 250 feet of water. No submarine diver can go to her, blah-de-blah. Then we see this account here. The schooner Westcott arrived in Kenosha from Charlotte, reports the following, which sank 15 miles, they say. Number of schooners, 6 in all, anchored together. Drawing nearer, they made out the schooners Vance and Hercules, blah-de-blah. Large load of wood, the men were seen throwing it off the deck load and taking aboard barrels, dry goods, boxes, and sundries that were floating up to the surface from the wreck. So were they anchored, was the water shallow enough to anchor? Was it 15 miles out? Or were they on the shipping lane? My bet is they were on the shipping lane. I think if you look off Big Sable Point, and it's deep, don't get me wrong, it's deep. But if she is 15 miles out, she's damn near to the Mid-Lake Ridge, right? But I think she's out here. The water here is pretty darn deep. This 150 isn't feet, it's meters. So we're talking about, almost 500 feet when you get out here. She's in deep water. So if she was, we also don't know, where she is north to south. They just say off Big Sable. So she could be a little south, in which case she'd be shallower, or she could be a little north, in which case she'd be deeper, or she could be directly off. We just don't get that kind of data. And believe me, I've looked at this wreck in great detail and looked at all the news articles. They never give you much. There's no wreck report for it. It's a tough one. The Java is a really cool ship. I would love to see this wreck found, but I think this is going to be one of the last vessels found. It's going to be tough. It'll probably be found by NOAA when they do their thing, but because NOAA reports their finds to the State Historic Preservation Officer, when they report it to Michigan, Michigan sits on these wrecks. They never release them. Not like Wisconsin. When NOAA finds a wreck in Wisconsin waters, our State Historical Society pretty much releases the find right away. There have been many finds already that NOAA's made that Michigan just sits on. And they can't be obtained through a FOIA request because they're archaeological sites. All right, let's move on. Number 4, the big steamer Andaste. This one is probably the most famous of the 6 because Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates keep looking for her. This is a big steel vessel, 267 feet long originally. She was shortened to 247 when she was lost. She's a semi-whaleback, built in 1892 at Cleveland. What I mean by that is she looks like a whaleback, but she's got a conventional bow with a big turret on it. It's kind of an unusual looking vessel. She was lost on Monday, September 9th, 1929, about mid-lake, between Grand Haven and Chicago. She was in the sand and gravel trade, and she had a big load of gravel when she was lost. So she's a frequently photographed vessel. There's probably 100 photos of the Andaste out there. Her sister ship, the Choctaw, was recently found on Lake Huron. They were sisters. So this ship was shortened in 1920 to pass through the Welland Canal. Some people think that may have weakened her original design. If she's found, it'll be interesting to see if she's in one piece. She was refitted as a sandsucker dredge in 1925, so she had a lot of machinery on her deck for that. And some people wonder if that didn't break free and cause her to go over. She departed Grand Haven, Michigan at 9:03 p.m. with a cargo of gravel, and there was an intense storm that followed. They had winds of 60 miles an hour, so this is a bad, bad storm. Recently, an account surfaced that Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates discovered from the steamer SS Alabama, which sighted her about mid-lake, southwest of Holland, Michigan. The Andaste was reported to be west-northwest of the steamer Alabama at a distance of about 8 to 10 miles at 2 a.m. So she was closer to Chicago than the Alabama. I'm not going to give away precisely where they saw her because that's sort of a trade secret of MSRA's, but I will give you what I think is the grid. A lot of debris came ashore on the beaches between Holland and Grand Haven, which is consistent with the storm direction. All hands were lost, depending on which account, between 25 and 29 people. 16 bodies were recovered, and most were wearing life jackets, indicating that they had time to prepare. Most people speculate that she fell into the trough of the seas and rolled over, although I think it's possible she could have broken in half. So where is she? She's way out there. So MSRA actually has been searching for her. I believe they found the Milwaukee, the steamer they found last year, while they were looking for her, because this is kind of the area. But if you draw a line from Milwaukee or from Grand Haven to Chicago, she was on it. She made it pretty far, I think. She's out here somewhere. Most speculation is that she's between 35 and 40 miles out in about 450 feet of water. I think she's going to be on or near that shipping lane from Grand Haven to Chicago. In fact, you could just go out there in this area and kind of scan along the shipping lane, which I think is what MSRA is doing, and probably eventually find her. I don't think she's going to be too far off the lane. So this is kind of what the bottom looks like there. Whether she's in the green area here, which is a little shallower, maybe 300 feet. There's a big, when I say shallower, I mean 300 feet, ish to 350 area out here. But then it starts to get into the South Chippewa Basin, which plunges pretty deep. So it gets to be into the 400s. And so it could be off the edge of that. And I think that's where people think she is, that she's going to be off the edge in the deep water. So the Andaste, I think she'll be found. I think MSRA will find her. This is an example of her boom equipment that was installed on her. You can see that this could have broken free and would have created all kinds of havoc and hell out there in a 60-mile-an-hour storm if she fell into the trough of the waves. So if MSRA doesn't find her, NOAA will. So Valerie, if you ever watch this, get out there. Find it before they do. Otherwise, we'll never know because the state won't say. Probably one of the most difficult searches of the Big Six. All right, let's move on. Number 3, the Charles Stewart Parnell. I've written about this one extensively. I have a manuscript about the shipwrecks of the Beavers and the Foxes, and I researched this wreck for the Beavers book. She's off Beaver Island. This was a wooden steamer, 256 feet long. As you can see, she's a wooden bulk carrier, right? Very few pictures were ever taken of this vessel. I think only 2, one of them that appeared in the newspapers of the day, and then there's a nice painting of her when she was new. She was lost on Wednesday, November 29th of 1905, when she burned and sank 7 miles west, and I would say west-northwest of Squaw Island. She was bound from Buffalo to Chicago with a cargo of hard anthracite coal. This ship normally ran in the bulk trades, iron ore, coal, and grain, between, the eastern lakes and the western lakes. So this was a trans-lake vessel. Frequent visitor to Lake Superior and Michigan. So interesting points, a couple of interesting points. The crew was eating Thanksgiving dinner, and a fire was detected in the cargo, in the anthracite coal, thought to be caused by a crewman smoking a cigarette, as everyone did back then. There was a pretty heavy sea running. And the steamer Harlem, which would later strand on Isle Royal, saw the ship burning, came to the rescue. However, the men had already left the ship in the lifeboats, and so the Harlem boarded the burning ship, found it empty, and attempted to tow it into the shallows. They didn't get there. The tow line broke long before they got to the shallows. Um, but the Harlem's captain submitted a bill for $10,000 to the Parnell's owners for the rescue attempt, which really incensed the Parnell owners. This is a little bit of an article about it, about the Thanksgiving dinner that was interrupted, and a little artist sketch of it burning there. It was a cold struggle in a heavy sea. The Harlem picked these guys up and took them to Milwaukee. And here you get to see, kind of the lone grainy picture. This is a little bit better representation of what she looked like from from a launch painting. This is hard to see, but they say she burned opposite Squaw Island. Now, there are a few other articles about this that I'm going to share with you, and I'll tell you where I think she is. And it gets interesting because this ship was found in 1909 by salvors, without a doubt. We know she was on the shipping lane, and if you look at the shipping lane, and this is the shipping lane of the day off the Beavers, and this is Squaw Island right here. You come up here, you make your turn, and you come down here. And they say she's west of Squaw Island. I think she's in this box, almost certainly, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. They say 6 or 7 miles west of Squaw Island are the accounts that I've found of this. But we get this article in 1909. The sunken hull of the Parnell was found. It lies in more than 200 feet of water, they say. Now, I absolutely don't believe that, and I'll tell you why. When the steamer sank, she had a bunch of coal, bloody-blah. The company will endeavor to recover the anthracite the same way the corn was pumped from the steamer Eber Ward near Mackinac. The steamer Soper is being used. They think they're going to cover about at least 100 tons a day. Then we get an article. The steamer Albert Soper arrived at Milwaukee Tuesday with a cargo of 600 tons of coal taken from the hold of the sunken steamer Parnell. The anthracite was recovered by use of a diving bell. I also think that's a bunch of BS. What I really think is, if you look here at the bathymetry of the area of Squaw, you see that there's a shipping lane. If you draw the shipping lane here and the turning point of Squaw Island, these ships tend to follow a feature called the Mackinac Channel, which is a submerged riverbed left by the glacial era on Lake Michigan. And so if you go, here's 2 miles off Squaw, 4 miles, and 6 miles. And if you look at the depths, you're going to see that, it's only about 130 feet deep here. The channel gets to be maybe 130 feet, maybe 120 feet deep. Not very deep. So it couldn't be in 200 feet of water if it's anywhere around this area, right? Even out here, it only gets to be 160 feet deep, and that's almost 10 miles west of Squaw Island. I think she's laying in the bottom of the Mackinac Channel. That's what I think. But I don't think she's very deep. I don't think she's in 220 feet of water. I don't think that they recovered the coal with a diving bell. I think that they recovered the coal just with divers on a skip, and I think she's in probably 100 feet of water or so. If I was to look for the Parnell, I would scan these white boxes here, because I think she's in the Mackinac Channel, because that's where the shipping lane runs intentionally to avoid all the reefs and the shallows there. This ship, I think she'll be found. I don't know of anyone that's looking for her actively. I've been up there. I chose to look for a different wreck instead of her, but if I had gone up there, I think I probably could have found her, I don't know, maybe in a long weekend. All right. Next ship. The steamer Frank L. Vance. This is one of the least sexy shipwrecks in the list. She's in my book, Ghosts of the Oceanic Coast, about shipwrecks of the Pentwater, Michigan area, because that is where she lies. The Vance was a big boat. She's the second biggest ship still missing on Lake Michigan. She's a wooden steamer, 258 feet long. built in 1887 at Cleveland, just before the steel steamer age, came about. So by the 1890s, she would have been built in steel. So this is one of the big wooden steamers, large. She burned and sank on Tuesday, October 4th, 1910, about 20 to 30 miles southeast of Ludington, Michigan. She was bound from Toledo, Ohio, for Milwaukee with coal. And this is another vessel similar to the Parnell that ran in the bulk trades. Now she had stopped at Ludington. We know that she had put into Ludington, and then left Ludington for Milwaukee. So she was on a shipping lane from Ludington to Milwaukee. That makes the ship a lot easier to find. She left Ludington at about 5 a.m. on Tuesday, October 4th. The steamer Père Marquette, when fire was discovered in her hold at about 8:30 a.m. So that's about 3.5 hours into the trip. The Père Marquette 19 and the Maggie Marshall, two big steamers, stood by with hoses and trained the hoses on the fire and took her crew off. Last that was said of her was that her boilers were expected to explode, sending her to the bottom. Although I don't know that would have happened. She burned for quite a while. This was also one of the first wrecks to be reported by wireless. The Père Marquette 18 was the first on the Great Lakes to be reported by wireless. This was the second. They wired in and to the United Wireless station at the Pabst Brewery, and they were able to send help. So this vessel didn't stay afloat for long, we don't think. We've got a few different articles about her and about how long she was on the surface. I have a few other articles that talk about her sinking. So let's talk about where she probably went down. This is the shipping lane of the day from Ludington to Milwaukee, and it goes right between, you see like Pentwater here is right between Big and Little Sauble Point. If we draw, the X's on the map here, you'll see that given her speed, which was known, I know how fast she could go. I think that she is between these two X's on this shipping lane, which places her roughly off Pentwater, Michigan, almost directly off Pentwater, Michigan, but way off Pentwater, Michigan. Incidentally, this ship was really prone to fire. She burned at least 3 times in her career. This is actually a known identified photo of her crew on her deck, hosing down the deck. But anyway, where is she? The grid is big for this ship. It's prohibitively large. It's about 10 by 8 miles. So, you could follow the shipping lane, but the wild card here is we don't know how long she drifted before she burned and how far off the shipping lane she drifted. One of the interesting things about this is that she could be on the Mid-Lake Plateau, right? This feature that rises. So she might not be in, 500 feet of water. She could be, up on the plateau. Probably not out here in the real shallow part of it, but I think she'd be in this grid here that you see. And whether she made it up here to the ridge, I don't know. But likely almost directly off of Pentwater, I think. So right at about this area, I think. All right. That is the Frank L. Vance. I think she will be the last found because people aren't looking for her. She's also burned, and my suspicion, and I can tell you that NOAA has a hard time with wrecks that are burned, that don't stand up high off the bottom, because they're using multi-beam sonar, which is not good for looking for wrecks. It's great for mapping the bottom, but if there's a wreck that's close to the bottom or that's flat down on the bottom in deep water, they tend not to find them. We know that because they've missed a number of other wrecks that were degraded. All right. Last but not least, the big one, the one you've all been waiting for, the W.H. Gilcher. This is the biggest ship still missing on Lake Michigan. She's a steel steamer of 302 feet, built 1891 at Cleveland. It's odd. I think 3 or 4 of the 6 were built at Cleveland, of the biggest ship still missing on Lake Michigan. Anyway, just came to mind. She was lost on Friday, October 28th, 1892, off South Fox Island. She was heading from Buffalo, New York to Milwaukee with coal. This is again a vessel that was running the bulk trades, trans-lake, iron ore and coal. She's only one photo was ever made of this vessel. It's been authenticated, and it's this one. It's a partial bow shot. This is the Gilcher's pilot house. Otherwise, we have this really nice artist conception of her from when she was launched. She and her sister, the Western Reserve, were kind of groundbreaking. They were the first big steel steamers to be built on the Great Lakes. Both had short careers. Both were lost pretty quickly. And the media, I think, correctly blamed faulty marine steel for the loss of both these ships. Because there were changes made. When they examined the steel that was used to make these ships, they found imperfections and inclusions in it. And the Bessemer process, or at least the more modern Bessemer process that they were using to make marine steel at that time, needed to be improved, and they did so pretty quickly. So by by a year after these ships were lost, they had figured out how to make better steel. The Western Reserve broke in half. We know that because there was a sole survivor who witnessed it break in half on the surface. I strongly suspect that this ship will be found in two pieces. If it's not, that will be somewhat vindicating of the steel, but I think she broke in half. All right, where is this ship and how did she go down? Well, she was bound down Lake Michigan from the Straits, and she didn't take the Manitou Passage. She was on the outside of the islands, so way out in the middle of the lake, heading down from Milwaukee. And she was last seen by the schooner Seaman, 15 miles west of South Fox Island. Her propeller was turning slowly. She wasn't underway. She was just trying to keep her head into the wind. She was in a big storm. This was a pretty violent October storm, and something. The little schooner survived it just fine, though. The Seaman, which was an older vessel, by the way. Bodies came ashore over the next few days on South Fox Island and on North Manitou Island. All 18 of the crew were lost. There are no survivors. And one other thing that happened is a schooner in the area, the Ostrich, was capsized and went ashore on South Manitou Island with no survivors in the same storm. And there was a lot of speculation that she collided with the Gilcher. I don't believe that. And the reason I don't believe that is that it was a violent storm. There's no reason why the Ostrich would have had to have collided with the Gilcher in order to be wrecked in that storm. It's sort of like the Armistice Day storm when they said that the Davik and the Minch had to have hit each other, and of course they didn't. The storm was certainly violent enough, but the two wrecks happened nearby, and so they paired them together in their minds. But I don't think that if we find that the Gilcher's broken in half, I don't think that the Ostrich necessarily was involved with her accident. All right. She shouldn't have broken in half. It was a violent storm, violent enough to take down the Ostrich, but not violent enough to break to sink a 300-foot steel vessel. So I do think she'll be found broken in two. There have been a lot of reports of this vessel's discovery over the years. If you look her up in the papers, you're going to see like all sorts of accounts from the 1930s, 40s, 50s of people claiming they found this wreck. I think the one that gets cited the most often is the big steamer off of North Manitou. What's her name? She's in shallow water. She's flattened in 40 feet of water. Big steel steamer. Every time that somebody finds that, they say it's the Gilcher, but she obviously hasn't been found. So where is the Gilcher, and why hasn't she been found? Well, we have this interesting account from the captain of the Seaman that I'll share with you in a bit. But what we know is that she was seen clearing the straits between 2 and 2:20 in the afternoon by the White Shoals Light ship. That was the last that was seen of her until the Seaman saw her. She came out to the turning point, which was here off Sochua Point, and headed down the lake, almost in the center of the lake. We know the wind was out of the west-northwest, and then it swung around to come more out of the north. This is where she was last seen, this side of South Fox Island. I think she probably maybe up here. I may have drawn this a little too far south, because the bodies washed ashore on the island, and the wind came around to the north. So I'll bet you she was somewhere maybe a little higher than this. She was last seen by the seaman, and he says he says at anchor, which that can't be, but he says 15 miles west of South Fox Light. So that would be here. Although I do suspect because bodies came ashore on South Fox and the wind was out of this side that she was actually up here. Wreckage also came ashore on North Manitou, which makes sense because the wind, as it swung out of the north, would tend to drive it down here. All right. So this is the grid. If I was to search for her, I guess I'd move this grid a little further north now in retrospect. The average depth in this grid is 500 feet. It's a deep grid. But the real problem with this grid isn't the location or the depth. It's what the bottom looks like out there. Here's South Fox Island. Here's the bottom. It's all over the place. Like you could, I mean, it could be up here, right? It could be in this shallower area. But this is a big grid. Even if you move this box north, you know, you'd have to scan an area at least the length of South Fox Island and probably, you know, that wide again to really cover the probability area. But it's out here west of South Fox. It didn't make it very far. We know that because bodies washed ashore on North Manitou and on South Fox. And the storm, we know the storm direction. So we know that she's in this grid out here. And like I said, I'd move this north maybe about another, 5 miles. All right. So she hasn't been found, obviously, because it's far from shore. If you want to get out there to look for this ship, and people are, by the way, I know guys that go out there and do this, you have to have a big boat. That boat has to get gallons to the mile, not miles to the gallon, and you have to have some serious tech equipment to do it. I know at least 2 groups that are seriously searching for her. This is the account of the captain of the Seaman. He says, when about 20 miles northwest of North Manitou and 15 miles due west of Fox Island Light, he said, 8 o'clock last Friday, we sighted a big steamer directly in front of us. As we had the right of way, we burned our torch for the steamer to make room for us, but she did not make the slightest move to do so. She lay with her head west-northwest, that would be into the wind, and did not seem to be working her wheel any more than to keep pointed into the wind. As she would not turn, we had to, and we passed her some 300 or 400 feet away. Weather thickened after that, and we lost sight of her. That's the last that was ever seen of the W.H. Gilcher. So I think she'll be found. I think people are looking for her. I think the grid isn't that big. I think she'll be found in the next few years. So those are the big 6 and why they haven't been found. I think I'm going to wrap up. I appreciate everybody who stuck around with me until the end and who were able to get logged in. And I think what I'll do is, for those of you who are interested, I will do a Zoom session after this for those who want to join, and I'll post it on the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group, and we can do Q&A. So thank you, everybody, for joining, and I will shut this down, and we can proceed to do a Q&A. So have a good evening, everybody, and if you didn't see it, catch it on YouTube, and watch for me to post the Zoom room where we can have a live Q&A. Good night, everybody.